today. So
Okay.
yes, good luck everybody. So I'll just start it off by once again welcoming everybody to the Summer of Protocols guest talk series. It's an 18-week program where 12 core researchers and 22 affiliate researchers are researching various aspects of protocols. You can find out more at summerofprotocols.com. Today we're talking with Jason Morton. Our next session will be next Tuesday, on Friday with Corey Levinson, and we'll be talking about the rules of climate protocols. The pre-read link is in our program calendar, which you can find at summerofprotocols.com. And I will hand it off to Tim to go ahead and introduce Jason for us.
Yeah, well, thanks, Josh. I got lucky that I ran into Jason like 3 weeks ago. So not a complete stranger that I'm introducing. But someone highly recommended by Venkat. I think you guys go way back to university. And yeah, I was really intrigued by the article that you shared. So the idea of like thinking of how time and space change the kind of games or interactions of agents. It feels like something that's like coming up in more and more fields, whether this is like in blockchain or in AI alignment. So yeah, very excited for you to kind of share your thoughts on that. I'll pause here and hand it over to you. I don't think I can do much beyond that for an intro. And you mentioned in the chat, so we can try. We've been trying something new for questions almost every one of these talks, trying to find the best model here. But let's try this time. Where we'll use the Discord. I think everyone here is in the Discord, and so this way that'll also keep the questions kind of more permanent after, and it allows replying even better than Zoom. Over to you, Jason.
Thank you so much. Thank you, Tim. I'm going to share my screen and switch over to slides. All right, everybody see that? Yeah, great, okay. So let's talk about unpacking money as a protocol. The idea is we can think about the role of money as something akin to a protocol or a way of accomplishing something, and we're going to dig into what that something might be, and then some fairly crazy ideas. So there's a bunch of different starting points for this. One is the article that you read about thinking about time and space and what that means and what kind of abstractions we've made. Another is just kind of this feeling that we have that's in the air that the level of financialization that we've reached is kind of a bad equilibrium. So I love this tweet from Morning Brew. There was a wallet that bought $8,000 worth of Shibu and shortly Shiba Inu, and it shortly became worth $5.7 billion. And to me, that's kind of a sign that something is breaking or that there's just no way to kind of run an economy. This is just a goblin mode icon, the idea that like, okay, is kind of financialization pushing us to a place where we don't have pro-social behaviors or where the way we're organizing ourselves is kind of become not optimal. So you will take the point of view that it's not just suboptimal, it's actually kind of morally bad, or it's resulting in behaviors or destruction of the world or of the climate, whatever else that's kind of a bad situation. Another way to think about it is that maybe the way that we've chosen to represent money and the way that we've chosen to organize the economy is kind of like the weak AI, the corporation AI version of gray goo, like where paperclip optimization. I've talked about AI alignment recently. In some sense, it's like a failure of alignment where the things that are getting optimized in this highly financialized economy are maybe not the solve problems that we want to solve. Anyway, there's lots of evidence and lots of people who are more articulate than me that are going to tell you that the game as it is currently up. There's a couple of Balaji slides. The thing on the right hand, which is about debt. The thing on the right hand side is from Peter Turchin's work about well-being and inequality in society and what he calls elite overproduction. And there's kind of a cyclic component that's laid on top of the debt cycle and other kind of social cycles. I think of that phenomenon as, or sort of the business cycle and the sort of double time crypto cycle inside of it as being a biological oscillator of kind. That's why I put the picture of the fireflies. So Turchin was an entomologist before he started to study social behavior and rise and fall of empires and things like that. And so he sort of views humans as just, just another biological creature that has cycles, natural biological isolators, just like any other. Anyway, so we're kind of probably at the end of a big giant debt cycle, possibly at the end of the American Empire, possibly at the end of the dollar, depending on your point of view. And that's kind of one of the big pictures. It's a debt cycle. But to me, it feels like there's something even deeper that's going wrong. It's not just the end of a short debt cycle, not even the end of a long debt cycle, but possibly something worse, which reflects the fact that our kind of money approach to money, the protocol or the abstraction of money, has started to started to become a leaky abstraction, started to show its weaknesses. So if that's true, we have to think about what comes next. I think this is a program sponsored by the Ethereum Foundation. I think for a lot of us, part of the answer to that is blockchain. But I think there's a lot of questions that we haven't answered yet. And the main point of this talk is not to talk about what comes next, but try to sort of take a Martian anthropologist point of view and ask, well, what was that about actually? What were we doing when we were talking about money, balances, ledgers, all of this? We're deeply embedded in this society, and we tend to think about money in the bank as some sort of physical reality, some sort of very real thing. But of course, it's just a socially constructed thing. And I want to dig into kind of it as a protocol and what it was that we were trying to accomplish with it. If it's broken and outdated, what could replace it? So first, I want to spend some time thinking about what it does. Then I'm going to propose three perspectives on what it does. I'm going to propose three crazy ideas for money-like things that we could kind of replace it with. And the goal there is not necessarily for to be serious proposals yet, but to sort of take this alien anthropologist view of what are we doing? And then the hope is that we'll sort of stimulate collectively coming up with some less bad ideas for what we might do going forward. Okay, so the first weird perspective, so I've worked on zero knowledge proofs, is that money in the sense of balances in the ledger is a form of zero knowledge proof. So what do I mean by that? So first of all, a zero knowledge proof is basically a cryptographic statement that takes some inputs, public and private inputs, does some cryptographic magic and produces an output such that you can believe that all of those inputs were true. And even recursively, you can believe that if someone else proves something to me, I can prove something to you without knowing how that first person proved it. So it's kind of a recursive proof of knowledge or of a fact. You could think about it like I could prove my Erdos number. How many degrees of connection are there between me and Erdos, or me and Kevin Bacon, without actually even knowing what those links were. And that's a lot like what happens when we work with a balance. So the other way to think about this is that money is like a compression technology. So what we do is we kind of walk through our life and we do a whole bunch of transactions. Maybe we issue some invoices in exchange for work that we did, or we receive a salary, and then we spend money. And in exchange for the money that we spent, we get this receipt, or not, to mark the money that we spent, we get a receipt that describes exactly what we bought. We bought some yogurt, we bought some mangoes, whatever. And then when we want to take another action, right? I want to buy another mango. I have to somehow summarize this history of transaction. Everything I've ever done for everyone else, everything they ever done for me, all of that gets compressed into one number, which is like a bank balance. If you imagine I have just one bank account, or a net worth, right? And then we kind of use that balance to decide whether the next favor that I asked for is granted or not. So what's happening is we're using money to decide whether, kind of for society to decide collectively whether we should be done a favor, whether I should be done a favor. So we have all these transactions, what I've done, what others have done for me. Future counterparties don't want or need all of that detail, but we need some way to weigh all of our good and bad deeds, like St. Peter at the gates of heaven, all the favors I've done, all the favors I've received, and decide, do I get that next mango, or have I already had enough mangoes, right? Have I done enough favors for others? Have I, changed the pattern of pixels on people's screens in a sufficiently pleasing way that I ought to be given this next favor? And so the system we use now is that we take all of those receipts and we take all those invoices, all those credits and debits, we compress them into a bank balance. Here's a bank that until recently provided that service. And then when we want to buy something, say I want a yacht or I want a mango, I go to my bank and I say, hey, can you tally up all the things that happened, compress them all into this kind of zero knowledge proof without revealing what all of those past transactions were? Just tell me, tell us whether this favor should be granted to me or not, right? And maybe they'll say, you know what, you can have the mango, but you can't have the boat. Right, so it's like a zero knowledge proof in the sense that this balance represents this whole history of transactions, and it's enforced by this network of banks and financial intermediaries. They have a series of reconciliation mechanisms. They have all kinds of old and new ways to kind of make sure that those dollars are registered and they don't get double spent. I bet, given the errors that we see in every kind of software, every kind of process, many dollars have been double spent in this protocol. But I don't know, it leaks, whether it matters or not is another question. Yeah, okay. So the idea is that a bank balance is a zero knowledge proof, a summary of everything we've done, a proof that I've done more good than I've done bad, or I've given more than I've received favors without revealing what those favors were. This technology was invented or plagiarized, depending on your point of view, by Luca Barciano di Pacioli, who's considered the father of double entry accounting, and he was a citizen of an early network state known as the Catholic Church. He developed this technology, double entry accounting, and it was fantastic technology in the 15th century. It enabled a tremendous growth of trade and everything else, financial systems based on it. But you can think about it as a technology that really is optimized for pen and paper ledger keeping, something you can keep track of in a book with a piece of paper. It's not perfect. Technically, it's not practical. It reduces everything to one dimension, and it has this sort of vaguely moral discomfort around the idea that we're tracking this human's worth or their human's favor as their net worth that somehow represents all of their contributions and vice versa, or contributions to society and vice versa. And I find that to be, I don't know, just a little bit of an affront to human dignity, let's say. So that brings the question, can you run an economy without tokens in a ledger? So certainly in the 15th century, the tokens in the ledger, whether they're gold or whatever, have a pretty stable value over time. Inflation is pretty small. There, of course, were large changes, but even more stable than things are now. But maybe in this Shiba Inu world, we're in this world now where every financial asset could get multiplied by 1 million or could go down by 99.99% every period. In such a world, we really can't meaningfully pay each other with tokens on a ledger in order to organize our labor and capital. The whole idea of financial capitalism as it's currently structured based on this ledger kind of falls apart. And I think we should ask ourselves, sort of as a thought experiment, is there an economic system that can survive in that kind of chaotic financial environment? For example, a pure command economy run by one all-knowing dictator would survive. It's not what we want to live in, but it could work, right? It doesn't need money to decide who does what, just uses violence. Anyway, we should also ask ourselves whether this token and ledger system even works that well, right? We think of those values, the amount of equity you own in a company or something, as having a hard reality to it, but it's precise in the sense that I can always calculate, I can multiply the last trade price times the balance, but that essentially never equals the value that we contributed to this common endeavor or the value that we withdraw in the end, which might depend more on like bargaining position and stuff like that. So I like to say that this ledger model is precise, but not accurate. So it's not clear that unless you take it to be kind of self-evidently true, it's actually all that functional. Anyway, so here's a thought experiment. Now we could do something else, right? We could, if we wanted to, instead of throwing away all those receipts and invoices, we could just save the data. We could just record, hey, I performed this work for someone. Hey, I got a mango from someone else. There's no money that changes hands. We just have the receipts and the invoices without values attached. Just what everyone did, not how much they paid for it, because this is a post-money economy. And then we could just ask an AI to look through all of those actions, all those favors we did, kind of the AI as St. Peter model, decide whether, given our balance of good things that we've done, favors for other and bads things, in other words, favors others have done for us, or good people have given us, should we get this next thing? Should we get this mango? Should we get this yacht, right? So it sort of seems dystopian when I say it like that. It's a kind of a dictator or an AI dictator. But the truth is we kind of already do this. It's just that we have a one parameter latent vector, this bank balance number, instead of a high dimensional latent vector that describes, the state of our balance with the rest of our society. Of course, it has other downsides, like it puts a lot of trust in the company that runs the AI, a lot of centralization and uncomfortable amount of power. Okay, so just one comment. Of course, I have to plug something else that I've worked on. Could we do that trustlessly instead of trusting the AI company? Yes, we could. One of the things that I work on is this project called Ezekiel, EZKL, which is a way to take a machine learning model or an AI model, put it into a zero knowledge proof, and verify it on the blockchain. And so you could use technologies like that to make an AI that has this kind of bizarre, enormous power over society, something that operates in a trustless way and a decentralized way, and not under the control of any one organization. Anyway, could we do it? Yes. Should we do it? But it's interesting to think about. Okay, so another concept of money that I want to dig into for a few minutes before we get to the relativistic stuff is kind of money as community or money as persuasion. So we're still struggling with the right words for this part. One way I like to think about it is fuzzy ownership. So there's this quote, best store of wealth is a high trust community, attributed to John Hillis, but Balaji mentioned it in his talk at Zoom a few weeks ago. I like to think about fuzzy ownership example as being this practice of barn raising in 19th century North America. Basically, you'd have a large community, people joined together often by faith, but also by just geography. And you could call upon your community to do a certain amount of unpaid labor for you, right? When it's time for me to build a barn to support my farm, I can ask for one, but not 100 barns, right? And my neighbors will pitch in and build that for me. That ability to draw on the community to produce this building is quite an expensive thing. I think about how much it would cost to build a building like that today. It's a critical part of your family's wealth and your family's survival. But it wasn't tokenized anyway. It wasn't like when I move to this community, I get one barn token and then I spend it, right? So we've certainly had functional societies that didn't rely on explicit ownership percentages, right? You can call on the resources of your community or your church or your tribe without in any sense directly spending a specific amount of stock or Ethereum or gold or whatever, right? So I just want to bring this up as kind of a question, is the idea of net worth or bank balance or number of shares of stock kind of a dystopian form of social credit where it quantifies our value to the community in a one-dimensional number? And in fact, our value to the community and our relationship to the community we're in is something much more complex and nuanced. And that system, worked okay for a long time, but now it's breaking down for other reasons. And maybe it's an interesting opportunity to kind of rethink our relationship to each other as mediated by financial capitalism. Another way to think about money is that it's kind of a way to convince someone to do something. In fact, that's all it is, right? So I offer to pay someone or pacify, I guess pay or pacify, in order to provide a favor for me. I want to ask them to give me a yogurt or a mango or a cup of coffee or do a task for me or work for me for 10 years. Money is kind of a record of favors done, and it's a little odd in a sense to promise in advance or to buy someone's labor in advance. And oftentimes you get a lot more satisfaction out of collaborating with someone on a common goal where you agree on a mission, or you're aligned, or you simply believe that this is something that needs to be done, versus working with someone who would be described as mercenary or coin operated, which are not usually considered positive descriptions. I mean, it's also good to kind of think about, take as a thought experience someone you admire, you know, a leader in your area, someone who's inspiring a lot of people to action towards some kind of bigger common goal. If they went and donated most of their money to some worthy cause, it's not clear they would become less influential, right? So the most inspirational people would actually become more influential probably if they took an action like that, right? And so in some sense, none of their power, or even negative amount of their power, comes from the money that they directly control. So that's a puzzle, right? Why is it so important? Okay, so in thinking about this fuzzy ownership thing, I'm an applied cryptographer, so I like to think about ways we could experiment with modeling this kind of ledger, this kind of organization that doesn't depend on a token ledger, that has a concept of fuzzy ownership. Let's think about how we could model a complex human organization that doesn't just copy over the token count and ledger model from the pre-crypto economy to the post-crypto economy, which is really built of consensus algorithms and signature algorithms. It has nothing to do with tokens unless we graft it on there. So one possible idea here is that, you know, participants in the community have some kind of shifting, randomized, fuzzy claim on the resources of the community, the organization, just like the people at the barn in the community that can ask for a barn, but not 100 barns. But their claim is very ambiguous. And I kind of like to think about that as since I'm a mathematician, statistician by training, a probability distribution over a possible ownership percentage. So instead of a point in the simplex or a fixed percentage ownership, there's some kind of randomized fuzzy ownership is one sort of quantitative way to do that. And then people should be able to withdraw small amounts from their community wealth as needed, and maybe by collapsing this distribution and testing against it. And they should be able to update the distribution which stays fuzzy, by sort of appreciating each other, saying thanks for building the barn, you know, or whatever. I recognize you as someone that's contributed to the community, and therefore you remain in good standing. So one way I like to think about this is with this, I have a little bit of math in this thing. So this Dirichlet distribution. So the Dirichlet distribution, you could think about as a probability distribution over the triangle. If in this triangle or simplex, each point of the triangle represents one person. There's three people. One person owns 100%, and the person A, B, or C depends on which vertex. You know, so the lower left vertex means person A owns 100%. The top vertex, person B, and the right vertex, the right point of the triangle, person C owns 100%. In between, there's other mixed ownership percentages like 0.5, 0.3, 0.2, and then in a traditional token ledger model, it's only ever a point somewhere in the triangle that represents what each of the three people owns. But if we add this notion of fuzzy ownership, we can have, instead of distribution over possible ownership, a fuzzy idea of what each person owns in the community. And if we're willing to do that, then we get a new economic, or like a new macroeconomic parameter, which is that we can change the distribution of ownership. We can change the center of the distribution by, you know, making a transfer from one person to another, but we can also change the definiteness. So we can dial up, you know, how blurry that distribution is in order to meet our aims. So for example, maybe we find the society has become too unequal, or it's too early to tell who's making the biggest contributions. In that case, we blur the distribution. Or maybe we need more precise incentives. People are not sure whether their work is going to be rewarded, and we need to dial down this blurriness. So then we focus the distribution. We make it more like a point or a specific ownership percentage, so that when I gain, you know, 0.01 more of the pool, I can notice it makes a difference in my life, right? So you know, we can change that at will, or we can do different governance for different decisions. Like maybe if we want something to be more like one person, one vote, then we dial the fuzziness all the way, so that it's basically each person has equal ownership. If we want something that's more like a shareholder vote, then we dial it in the opposite direction to be more precise. And then in this scenario, if I want to test my if my balance is greater than some percentage, I have, in this example, like if you look at the red curve here, beta distribution is a one particular probability distribution over the marginals. So I can think about, instead of everyone, I can think about me versus the rest, and then it becomes a one-dimensional distribution like this. And I want to say, oh, do I have at least T% of the pool because I want to withdraw T% in order to go buy a mango or a yacht? Then what we can do is produce a proof or produce a test, say in a smart contract. I have an implementation that I can share with people.
Thank you.
Great. Thank you for your patience. Okay, so this object, this Dirichlet distribution, this fuzzy ownership idea. So when you think about the marginals of this, by which I mean, for any one individual, if I want to make a transaction, like I want to withdraw some money from the pool in order to go buy a mango in exchange for whatever assets the pool has together, what really matters is my ownership versus everyone else's ownership, right? And that turns out the marginal distributions in the sense of me versus everyone else are a beta distribution. Beta distribution is a way that you would do something like quantify uncertainty about a coin flip. I don't know in advance what my what the bias of a biased coin is. So I think about it as being, well, it's just uniform. And then can we still hear me okay? Yeah, okay. So, and then as I accumulate evidence, like I get 2 heads and 8 tails, then I update my belief about what the bias would be, and this beta 2/8 represents 2 heads and 8 tails, for example. So the marginal distributions of this Dirichlet are this beta distribution, and what I can do is to sort of prove my ownership percentage is greater than some threshold. I request 0.05 of the pool. I draw from this beta distribution that represents my percent ownership, and then I get either success or failure. Success if the draw that I take is larger than the threshold that we set, and failure if it's lower. So if I draw 0.2, and I ask for 0.05, then I win. If I draw 0.01 and I ask for 0.05, then I lose and I don't get it. And we can apply the same logic for yes votes and no votes, for example. Yeah, and I see a comment that says one thing's become too transactional, definite, and it can be damaging to the relationship, from Angela. Yeah, I agree. This is exactly the kind of thing that we're sort of trying to represent. The hope is that by implementing some kind of fuzzy ownership, it reduces how transactional a community is, and it makes it more, improves kind of allegiance, togetherness, and so on. Yeah, definitely the first 5,000 years also is a big inspiration for this idea. Okay, so I want to move on next to this idea about money as a projection to a lower dimensional space-time. And some of you probably read the article that I wrote a few years ago about this. And so this will be a little bit more abbreviated. Okay, so the premise here is that the idea of a global balance, the idea of a bank, is fundamentally a non-physical idea, right? So like people will complain, oh, bankers are so one-dimensional. So this is sort of literally true. Like the idea of a bank is kind of one-dimensional in a sense. I'll make it precise in a second. When there was this period, this telegraph period of finance where information traveled much faster than computation, right? On the left is there's an accountant working with paper, and he can only do things so quickly. And then information about accounts or transactions could travel at the speed of light using using lawyers, and that approximation worked. But now it's not true anymore, and this approximation has become terrible and starting to break a lot of things. So the physics version of this is something called Minkowski space, which is just the space we live in, or a flat version of the space we live in, space-time we live in. So we have some number of space dimensions. Here on the left, there's a light cone with 2 space dimensions. So there's a 2-dimensional space, and then vertically we write time. So each event or observer, what's marked observer there, is like a point in space-time. It has a future light cone. All of the events in this space-time that are that have it in their past to which it is causal, and it has a past light cone, which is kind of all of the events that are in the past, which we can see. If it's outside the past light cone, then even if it happened, in some sense happened, we can't actually observe it until later on in our, a time in our future. And people think about distributed systems, spend a lot of time thinking about this kind of problem because we are faced with a world in which the speed of light is finite. And you can think about the double spend problem in a cryptocurrency or in a bank account problem, right, as just this type of situation. What happens is that as long as I have a one-dimensional space and two events that are separated in a space-like way, in the sense that there's not enough time for light to get from one event to the next, they happen simultaneously in some reference frame. Those two events can happen, and then some third observer can observe those events at the same time, right? They can be simultaneous, and that means that there's no way for that observer to enforce reject one of them if the other one happened first. So it's double spend as possible. There's kind of a causal risk. And what we're doing when we think about a global balance of tokens, a bank account or a ledger, is we're taking this space-time. The space we live in, of course, is M4, is 3 space dimensions and 1 time dimension, and we're projecting it down to a space in which there are 0 space dimensions and 1 time dimension. That is, we're trying to linearize all of the events that happen and decide, did the left one spend first or did the right one spend first? And of course, the nature of relativity tells us that there's some ambiguity when we do that, right? Depends on the observer what the order of those events were, and there's some information that's lost, right? So there's lots of ways of thinking about the information that's lost. One is this kind of ambiguity. One is a need for global synchronization in order to simulate this 0 plus 1, which is often the choice that we make because it's easier to think about. Or we can think about it as adding kind of uncertainty, right? I mean, in some cases, if we have some kind of rate limits, then we can think about transactions that happened as representing intervals of things that could possibly be true, and we can accumulate all that uncertainty in order to have kind of a view on what's happened that's 0 dimensional. So the problem of double spend, or I have a bank account I try to withdraw, $200 from my bank account or $400 from my bank account in Shanghai and New York at the same time, and I only have $400, and both transactions go through, is a kind of causal risk or an error that's caused by this projection of what we really live in, which is a 3 plus 1 dimensional space-time to a 0 plus 1 dimensional space-time in which our abstractions about money operate. And when I say that bank balances are fundamentally non-physical, I mean that we just can't faithfully project 3 plus 1 dimensional Minkowski space to 0 plus 1 dimensional Minkowski space. And there's various ways to prove that. But I hope it's clear that it's just impossible. Okay, so that's fine and well. And we talked in the book in the article about a scenario where we think about intergalactic or interstellar finance, where we're multiple light years away and we have whole lifetimes that happen in the time it takes for information about a transaction to flow from one planet to another planet. And here, I want to convince you that we're actually already in that world. So in that interstellar world. So you think about floating point operations, right? So take these two numbers, 31.1732, 1734.88297, and multiply them. If you sat down and multiplied them using your usual high school multiplication algorithm, I don't know, maybe it would take you a minute. Let's say it takes a minute. Maybe it will take you 30 seconds. It'll take me a minute. Adding is a little faster than multiplying, et cetera, right? Okay, so that means you could do about 60 of these per hour, 480 in an 8-hour day, call it 500, 200 working days in a year, call it 100,000. Then do that for 20 years and you have maybe 2 million of these floating point multiplications that you can do in kind of a life's work, right? Order of magnitude. Okay. Newest chip from NVIDIA is called the H100. It goes at 1 petaflops per second. That means that in the time it takes the light that you're looking at, assuming you're still watching this, to go from the screen to your eyes, light moves about 1 foot per nanosecond. So 2 nanoseconds, two clock cycles at 1 gigahertz, for example. It can do 2 million of these operations, right? So it's basically, it can do your life's work in the time it takes for light to go from the screen to your eyes, right? That's sort of the order of magnitude of how fast these things are now. And they can be parallelized. You can have a whole data center full of them. Okay, crazy, right? So if we want to send a signal to the other side of the world and back, we're talking about maybe 150,000 times that, because it's 150 or 300 milliseconds. And now you're talking about the whole working life of a small city that happens, as the signal goes around the world and back from here in Boston to Shanghai. And then if you have a whole cabinet of these things, we're talking about a device that can push out the life's work of everybody alive today per second, right? And of course, we do smarter things than multiplying floating point numbers, but the point is that kind of order of magnitude in terms of certain kinds of decision-making, financial decision-making, accounting, stuff like that we can do. This is the world we live in, right? We're in a kind of a lives per foot era, right? We've scaled down the interstellar finance thing, and civilizations rise and fall in the time it takes information to propagate around the world. And compute is getting faster, light is not getting any faster. So this problem is getting worse. We're deep in this finite speed of light regime, this interstellar finance era. And I think we can't pretend that global state is possible anymore. Assumptions about how state works, how balances work, natural rate limits have been just destroyed. And I think this is part of why money as a protocol is breaking, or at least the Telegram era money on which our current financial system is still based. Already we're seeing the last few weeks, like flash bank runs. There's no time for JP Morgan to stroll from the corner to the stock exchange and place a buy order and calm everyone down. This is chat groups and everything else. Humans push a button, machines execute, and it's over. But we're still in the era where humans are in the loop. And pretty soon, with all machine decision-making, this whole thing can play out in milliseconds. And I expect that, we'll see that soon. In some sense, we've already have. Okay, so now we're going to get back into some crazy ideas, other ways money could work. So one extreme solution to this problem, as I mentioned in the article, is to tie balances tightly to reference frames. In other words, you say, you don't have a balance, a bank balance or Ethereum balance, you have this much balance at this city or this point on the planet, and you have this much balance at a different point on the planet, and then your money is kind of spread out, like buried in a whole bunch of little caches in the ground. And when you want to spend, you run around collecting those. Another way is to think more in terms of rates of transfer, rate limits than balances. I can spend a certain amount from a certain place per second or per minute. Or we can relax the idea that a balance is a definite number. And then we're already sort of doing this with this idea of rate limits. Rate limits plus the stale information from our past light cone, we kind of aggregate that information and we get intervals. So-and-so had a balance of this much last time I got a live update. She couldn't have spent more than 1 Martian credit per minute. And therefore, by now, she has between what she had before and that much minus the number of minutes times her rate limit, right? And then you kind of add up all those intervals and you start to get something that looks like a smooth probability distribution. Another way to think about this is this idea that I call the internet, okay? So you can think about it like each node in the network or each planet has an urn of colored balls that kind of represent tokens, credits in the system. They have some cache of value, gold or barns or whatever, and they have a keeper. So what the keeper does can do a few operations. It can add a ball, maybe in exchange for a deposit of gold or a building of a barn. It can remove a ball from the urn of your color. So every person has a color in this system, like red or green. Remove a ball of red, color red, or it can draw some number of balls and check how many of them are your color. So if your color is red, and you have 10 balls in a 100 ball urn, if you draw all the balls, you're sure to get 10%. If you draw 5 balls, You may or may not. If you draw 30 balls, you'll probably get at least one of your color. And so you would use that definiteness parameter would be how many balls you draw to do this test. You can make a deposit by adding gold, and the urn keeper adds a ball of your color. To withdraw a ball, you do this thing where we draw out a whole bunch. We draw out 30 balls, and if I get one, then I pass, and if I don't, then I fail. If I make a small request, or if I claim a small proportion, then it's likely it will be granted. If I claim a large proportion, it's unlikely, and there's various ways to refine this to make it more sort of fair or more resilient to attack. And then what happens is this urn keeper transmits its actions to the other keepers at the speed of light, and they do the same thing. So if he added a ball, he sends it out to all the other urn keepers, and they add a ball when they get the signal. If he removed a ball of a green ball, then he sends it out, and they all remove a green ball when they get the signal. And you rate limit the actions. So we can't do more than one ball per minute or one ball per second, one action per second. And the idea is that because we've randomized kind of the balances everywhere, as an observer on two different planets, although the urns are always out of sync, essentially always out of sync, we can't statistically prove it. We can't statistically detect the fact that the urns are always a little out of sync. So it's kind of like a differential privacy model of money, right? So by randomizing the balances, maybe because we wanted people to behave in a more pro-social way, we also potentially get some interesting scalability properties where, from the point of view of the observers, it's as though the system functions instantaneously as long as they're willing to accept this little bit of uncertainty. They can't prove, in a statistical sense, that the system has not transmitted that information instantaneously. Or we could relax assumptions with the Dirichlet pool, which is basically a related idea. So this is another way of expressing this indistinguishability property. Basically, if you have the parameter 532, and then your distribution looks like on the left, and your marginal density of the person with 5 looks like it does on the bottom. Person with 2 transfers 0.1 to the person with 3, and now the distribution, it looks like it does on the right. The marginal density of the person with 5 looks like it does on the bottom. And the point is that these two blue distributions, I should have put the 3 distribution on the bottom, but because the 5 is not changed. But these two distributions, the two triangles, are hard to distinguish statistically. And so as long as they don't change too quickly, maybe it doesn't matter that everything is out of sync. Okay. So that is it. I'll leave a little 10 minutes for questions. So just to reiterate, the thesis here is that the global balanced token ledgers, the money as a protocol that we've been using, are kind of obsolete and a leaky abstraction. We talked about money as a zero knowledge proof with one parameter, but it could have many parameters. We talked about money as a representation of community membership and ability to persuade others. And we talked about money as an increasingly untenable and non-physical projection onto one observer in a many observer universe. And our 3 crazy ideas, thought experiments for other ways it could possibly work, just to stimulate discussion, are an AI St. Peter, a Dirichlet pool, and the internet. Okay, then that is all I have prepared, so we can just sort of open up for questions now.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Jason, for that presentation. If people have questions they would like to ask, feel free to go ahead and raise your hand. I don't see any specific questions in the chat here, so feel free to take it away.
Yeah, we can grab, and I can share the slides. We can also maybe look at some of the things from Discord. I'll wait for, please jump in if you want. Okay. The medium of contingency and inverse view of the market. Dorian, do you want to say something about what?
That book, I've only read a synopsis of it, but the premise, the thesis of it is that derivatives are actually the thing that you should be looking at, and the underlying is actually the epiphenomenon, which is kind of just an interesting take. I can probably dig out the synopsis of it, and I have the PDF of it somewhere kicking around as well. I haven't dug into it yet because it's like 14,000th on my list of things to do. But I was interested. I just threw it down, like the fact that we're operating at sort of like sub-relativistic time in general, and the fact that like transactions are discrete, sort of got me thinking, like just sort of the discretization of time, and like it's almost as if, if you just had like two objects and you're going to slam them together, like, one's got to go because there's a sort of discreteness there aspect of it. And I was sort of wondering, just offhand, like how you're sort of thinking about just the fact that time is continuous and the sort of discretization of transactions, especially when you're thinking about stuff like beta distributions and so on.
Yeah, I mean, I maybe don't have a lot of great insights there. I think one is, the discretization in order to have sync points is interesting. I mean, that's kind of how we do it now, right? Blocks, stuff like that. And I think that the continuous time part, my intuition is that we're really going to have to start thinking more about spending rates rather than balances in order to kind of deal with the scaling problems that these sort of, and by these I mean these fundamental scaling problems with like physics. The speed of light hasn't changed, but the markets are getting faster and faster. And yeah, so I think like having a continuous time rate and then having a asynchronous mechanism for clearing is maybe the right direction to go. But, yeah.
Cool. Rafa, you have a question?
Yeah, I'm curious if you've either encountered already or have any insight on like, as the speed of kind of money increases, and like you said, the focus becomes more on rates of spending versus on balances. If you're seeing any influences, any changes on organizational structures of firms as a result of that kind of like change and adjustment. I don't know. I think I can't think of any specific changes right now, but I'm curious from your conversations and your research.
I feel like
especially
we're not seeing the changes yet.
Yeah.
But I think we will. And I think that one of the things is that firms are just going to have to get better at dealing with ambiguity, at least on small timescales. And I think in some sense we see that in the kind of, new startups are mostly about dealing with ambiguity, and the size of the firms gets smaller and smaller. Maybe that's somehow related. But yeah, certainly this kind of, obviously this thesis is around fuzziness, right? So what I think that that ambiguity is pretty fundamental, and the sort of traditional obsession with getting the numbers, getting them right, we still want to do that when we can, but it's not, we shouldn't expect to be able to use that information to make decisions.
Yeah, it's interesting because like the flash crashes could like wipe out your organization before you even know that it exists, like that it happened. And so it makes me wonder about, for example, insurance policies and how those might change to protect you against like new types of volatility. And as a result of that, like what processes you might need to put in place, and like almost like we might have a requirement for certain automation as part of that insurance policy.
Yeah, requirement for automation. That's kind of funny. In other words, it's not possible for a human to react in time, and therefore you have to have a computer to react in time, just like you'll need a computer drone, or you have to have an AI drone in order to be able to fight an air battle in the future, right? You'll need a AI with real authority in order to be able to fight a financial battle. That seems plausible to me. One of the other things that connects to the question that Venkatesh just asked, which is about codifying economic in a stochastic way, where I never deterministically be sure whether I'll get the mango or how I'll pay, and what's the UX of that. I think so I have two answers to that. One of them is, I think, as long as you never, in the ordinary course of business, when you're just buying the mango or the coffee, the chance of failure is vanishingly small. So most of this constructions, your chance that your coffee transaction won't go through is similar to the chance that, or smaller than the chance that won't go through because the credit card reader doesn't accept it. So it's tiny. It's only for the big transactions that you either have to accept the randomness or you have to wait longer for finality, right? So maybe there's a separate protocol, or you just do many small transactions. So you have to wait for the kind of causality stuff to clear. And for the human time scale, that might only be minutes, right? Depending on how far flung your civilization is. The other thing that I'd say is that this ties in a lot to what credit is, right? In some sense, in such a randomized economy, there's going to be people who enter who are willing to take that risk and get paid for it, right? So they're like, they're somewhere between people that take on causality risk, double spend risk. You can think of it, double spend as a flavor of causality risk, and in another sense, they're taking on credit risk, right? So I think this kind of credit risk that comes from causality is going to become more important. And certainly there'll be people that show up to make it so that, oh, I can just get a deterministic transaction, and they will take the risk that that transaction fails based on the information they have. So it's an arbitrage thing.
Great. Do we have any other questions? Last call. Great. Well, thanks so much for joining us today, Jason, for that insightful discussion.
Thank you so much for your attention. And please, if anybody wants to chat about these things, of course, I want to chat about it. So get in touch. We'll talk. And also building some of these experiments out in various stages, just to see, just to kind of throw it out there and see what happens, and see whether it gives us information about what this future might look like. So that'll be on Discord.
Great.
Thank you so much.
All right. Thank you, Jason. We will see everybody on Friday for the guest talk with Corey Levinson entitled Who Writes the Rules of Climate Protocols? So thanks everyone for joining, and we'll see you Friday.